Hare Krishna, everyone. Welcome back to the Engaged Bhakti podcast. I am your host, Krishna Kishore Das, aka Dr. Christopher Fichi, and we're back with another episode. If you're checking us out on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe, and you'll get notices of new episodes as we post them. If you checked us out through Facebook, like our Facebook page as well, as we're building up our community of conversation here, our lo-fi indie rock podcast, as I was just talking about with my dear friend and guest today, Alysia Radder, also aka Ali Krishna Devi Dasi. Ali Krishna, thank you for joining us all the way from the land of the rising sun. It is evening here and it is morning where you are.
Live from the suburbs of Tokyo.
This is an international podcast. We are not bound by borderlines. So, Ali Krishna, I'll just give a little official bio of you for folks who may not know you. I imagine some folks who are watching do. You graduated with a master's degree in religion and a minor in nonprofit organizational leadership. Yeah, master's degree in religions. We're power to those peoples. You're a graduate student at the University of Florida, and your coursework is focused on topics such as Hinduism and ecology, food politics, environmental ethics, and nonprofit management. You're formerly the Director of Outreach at the University of Florida Center for the Study of Hindu Traditions, and you currently serve as an academic advisor for the Bhumi Project, which is now Bhumi Global, an international environmental awareness campaign facilitated by the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies in partnership with the Alliance of Religions and Conservation. So welcome. Thank you, Ali Krishna, for joining us. We have a history going back to the good old days. Well, the good old days, the strange old days, the Krishna-filled days at New Vrindavan, where we were both exploring the mystery of monastic life in our own ways. This was back, what was like 2006, 2007, right?
2007.
Yeah, so we are officially Dham Vasis for life, having lived in the Dham. New Vrindavan is our eternal home, for better or for worse. And I always kind of say it was, such an amazing experience living there. It also felt like an experience you kind of survived. Right?
Yeah, well, you were there longer than I was. And also I was reflecting when you had suggested that we start the podcast, just mentioning that we both actually sort of moved into the ashram around the same time,
Yeah.
Which is, we share so many interests and have both sort of pursued our passion of environmentalism academically. So interesting. But yeah, we started there together. I was thinking that the experience might have been quite different for you because I was basically alone.
Yeah.
There was no women in the ashram. There are very few women. There are a few older women who are pujaris, and it was basically me. But then I was thinking, but the men's ashram was actually quite full.
Yeah, this is actually a whole podcast topic we could have about seeking monastic life, because I have other friends and colleagues who are seeking this too. But yeah, we did, and how often when you try to find that, it's a very lonely experience. Yeah, we had a whole crew of folks that were doing basically the old Radhanath Swami college preaching circuit, like Ohio University, West Virginia, University of Pittsburgh. And it was great. We had like a lot of programs going on, houses there. Of course, but also New Vrindavan life was a lot of like hauling stuff in the snow and like and gardening and real down home seva. And then like
most of my time was just spent changing clothes so I could go from like a morning program to the barn to milk the cows, come back for group puja, then change again so I could go to the kitchen and help prepare lunch. There was a lot of like changing involved.
Yeah, and just so many amazing devotees we got to know. Like I've dear friendships with Soma Prabhu and Madhava Ghosh, the late great Madhava Ghosh, and just loved having lunch with them. And of course, we both spent time with His Holiness Varshana Swami while we were there too, who is just such an illustrious personality.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we were saying, the key was to like finish all of your service and then just like run up the hill and sit at the feet of Krishna Swami for hours.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then if you were fortunate enough, you could hear him chanting in the temple room early in the morning. And yeah, I have so much love for New Vrindavan. I haven't been there for many, many years, but yeah, actually, if I could just, I have so much love for that community. I don't know who is still there, but I'm so grateful that every single one of those people who are there. And it was just, yeah, it was an amazing experience. I was also reflecting on how it was, although there were very few women, it just so happened that was maybe the one temple in the world where there was both a female president, temple president, LGBT.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was a very sort of, I don't know if I would have survived anywhere else in a sense. Yeah. So yeah, that was a very formative period.
Yeah, it's a very mystical place, and I think it's anyone who's spent time there and really, when I say survived, I mean, it can also, places had a very complex history, and a lot of that emerges in relationships, but there's also such deep love for that community of people who, we just recently had Sankirtan Prabhu Andy Frankel on our last episode of the podcast too, and he's still going on there and still doing a lot of teaching and storytelling, and the devotees have really given so much of their heart and life there, and for us next generation folks, we take that with us. So yeah. So as you were saying, we've gone through different, or not different, but similar pathways in this process, and I was really happy you wanted to join the podcast and talk about this concept of engaged bhakti that we're exploring, this community we're trying to build. And I think one of the things we've been trying to say throughout the first few episodes of this is that we're not coming in with kind of a set in stone argument about what this is. I certainly have inclinations and arguments that I think inspired me to launch this podcast, to say that this practice of bhakti that we find so powerful in our lives and in our communities can be of great service to this very chaotic time that we live in. It feels continuously like the world is ending this year. It was interesting this particular week, just out here. Right now I'm in office I'm using at Iona College in New Rochelle. It was like the past couple of days, it was like the sun looks kind of hazy, and then people were saying, well, that's actually from the smoke from the fires in California. So there's this apocalyptic tinge to everything that's going on right now, and there's a question of kind of just, for many of us who work and serve in the world, how to take the urgency of our teachings and our tradition to apply to all of these challenges. But it's not so cut and dry all the time. And I think, as we've talked about, we will want to share with folks who are watching, is that we need to kind of seriously interrogate or problematize, these nice words we like to use as scholars, but really kind of dig into this concept and see what we mean, to see if there's really, what is there and not there when we're talking about the application of bhakti in terms of social justice work or social engagement. And you wanted to kind of problematize it a little bit so we could get perhaps a clearer picture going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have, I've always sort of identified myself as an environmental activist, and I have been sort of pursuing a path of activism since the tuna fish campaign in 6th grade for, I don't know if you remember that, the big Save the Dolphin campaign, modifying the tuna fish fishing nets.
Yeah.
Especially for our generation, we've come up this idea of climate change, climate destabilization has been very much part of my life. I studied environmental science as an undergrad, so I was like bombarded with all the data as a person, and and so I would say a lot of my activism in the beginning was fear-based. this idea of this apocalyptic idea. And, you know, because it was scary. I saw all the data, I was presented with all the data, and none of it was good. And that was 20 years ago. So, and then I found myself in different situations. I studied sustainable development in southern Mexico, and that was after the famous like Zapatista march to the middle of Chiapas. That was a very, I mean, that it's sort of like the idea of apocalypse. It emerges in every generation multiple times. So I think it's one of those things that we have to be careful about. But anyway, that's sort of a side thought to this larger idea of problematizing the sort of the happy, what we feel is maybe a natural relationship between bhakti and social activism or environmental activism. So yeah, I've been asking myself these questions throughout my life. Is what is the greatest good? What is the greatest activism? What is the greatest good we can do for humanity? And sort of tried out a lot of different things like environmental, just direct action, and you know, learning about sustainable agriculture and subsistence farming and all those things. But anyway, so Bhakti, I've landed at Bhakti and I've been here for some time now. But I have some questions with regards I believe in Bhakti, and I believe in the force of Bhakti as a powerful agent of sort of radical change and well work. But I think we need to be really careful when we approach it. So yeah, one of the things I want to push back against is this idea of Bhakti as as this sort of mythological, like, equalizing force against caste hierarchy and patriarchy. Because if we look historically, there's not really any examples that I know of where masses of people have been liberated in the sense of sort of socio-political oppression, or, you know, I don't know of any cases or instances in which masses have been delivered. So I think that's an important, I think sometimes we romanticize this idea of the leveling, sort of social leveling that Bhakti promotes. So that's the idea of Bhakti as a historical vehicle of justice. We need to problematize that, and also we need to think about that, and also the specifically the environmental, from an environmental justice perspective, or when we for many years. Actually, yeah, for many years. So funny because we both had blogs, yoga and ecology blog. I had Krishna consciousness and environmental awareness, ecological awareness.
Yeah, I remember that.
You know, there was nothing I loved more than just like going through the scriptures and finding these beautiful descriptions of nature, or these passages that describe the merit of protecting the holy Dham, the places of pilgrimage. And there's nothing more I love than finding those passages. But later on, as because of my academic training, I was forced to look at that more critically, and within the field of religion and ecology, sort of you learn that, sort of the contention that religious traditions are environmentally friendly is an interpretation of tradition rather than a traditional interpretation. Because there's you can't find any concept of, let's say, environmental crisis or ecosystem sustainable development in these ancient texts. We're applying our sort of modern ecological knowledge. So I'm not saying that it's not a good thing to do this, because there is a lot of inspiration we can draw from that, and a lot of symbolic and powerful teachings that we can take away from doing that sort of work. But I think we should be really clear that it's a conscious, reflective application of religious ideas, contemporary environmental concerns.
Yeah. A couple of things came to mind. Is I had the opportunity to study with Jack Hawley, who's a scholar of Bhakti at Barnard University in New York. And one of the things he talks about in one of his books about the history of the Bhakti movement was that oftentimes sometimes the Bhakti movement is described through this term Andalan, which has the connotations of being like a social movement. But he always points out in his work on Bhakti that there's always this tension that, as you were saying, there's not this kind of clear history of different poets, saints, practitioners of Bhakti, especially during the period of like medieval India and recent history. There hasn't necessarily been this kind of widespread social movement. We talk about how like Lord Chaitanya led the first like civil disobedience movement, and that's an interesting application of that concept of civil disobedience. I mean, I can understand what Prabhupada was trying to say and kind of coming from his Gandhian background, but that's even not necessarily like an example of like social justice per se. It was to be allowed that the devotees could practice Sankirtan at the time. And it also brings to mind something. So there's a scholar, David Haberman, I think we both know, who is a beautiful devotee himself and has done this amazing work on the Yamuna River and the worship of the Yamuna River, the beautiful like eco-theology of the Yamuna River. But one of the striking things in his book, which is called River of Love in an Age of Pollution, he says that sometimes people can use their bhakti and their devotion to overlook the fact that the river is polluted, or to say, oh, it's just polluted on a material level and therefore it's not polluted on a spiritual level. Sometimes the priests in the temples will encourage this kind of consciousness. And he points out that that is not exactly productive for doing the kind of actual like work of cleaning the river, of trying to adjust social practices so you don't pollute the river. So even the practice of devotion itself can sometimes be an excuse to overlook the material realities that are at hand. And
such a powerful point. And Emma Tomlin, this religious scholar of ecology, speaks to that, addresses that specifically when she talks about the difference between nature religion and religious environmentalism. Nature religion, she differentiates. Like nature religion is the worship of elements of the natural world. For example, certain trees and tree groves are considered sacred in Hinduism. But it's whereas religious environmentalism, again, that's sort of the conscious reflective application of religious ideas to contemporary environmental concerns. So the interesting thing about nature religion is that, which scholars of Indian environmental history are quick to point out, the worship of nature, namely sacred rivers, does not engender and in many cases precludes this ecological protection. And you could expect that to goddess worship, sort of this ancient practice of goddess worship has never led to the social uplift of women.
Mm-hmm.
So it's I think, yeah, again, it's one of those really, one of the reasons why we should problematize sort of this construction of a eco-theology, because it's a bit of a, yeah, it's sort of a slippery slope, or there's problems there, and it's not. We think that the glorification of these trees might prevent, but in some cases it has actually prevented. So it's such an interesting point that should be considered. And
I just this point about being, saying like reflective and conscious of the fact that I was actually just teaching my students this yesterday about the fact that religion and religious traditions. In fact, religions and traditions are very much the same thing. There's always something about, you can never put religion into a box. People really try to do that. That's where the problem starts, and try to categorize and define everything by a very like rigid definition, or if not a rigid definition, but like, as we're talking about, an idea. And of course, this is something I wrestle with, that, our tradition's inherently ecological, when we really have to look at the particular substance and see that in some instances it's not. Like, I always really struggle with that pastime in the Bhagavatam where I think it's King Prithu is like dragging earth around and like being, you could interpret that as being like abusive. And like, how do you, I've had conversations with other devotees about that. Like, if I'm trying to create an eco-theology tradition with others, doing that in concert with others, how do we deal with pastimes such as that, and these kinds of, and what we're talking about with David Haberman too. So religions, traditions are always really complicated and very fluid and full of contradictions. This is something, I think we've both learned as scholars of religion. And I think we've both had the good opportunity of studying with senior scholars of our tradition. I know you're a disciple of Hridayananda Goswami Maharaj, who show us that, doing this kind of like interrogation work is important, and also doesn't make you a bad devotee either. It can actually help you to like become more rooted in the truth of our tradition, especially when we deal with the complexities of all of this. We kind of get more to the truth of things, even if that truth is not always easy to grasp. I think that's an important thing we should know. It's like, truth is there, but we can't be necessarily like attached or think we own it, or think we have one particular interpretation that stands for all time.
Yeah. I mean, just even well, first of all, yeah, it's essential we engage our intellect. That's Buddha yoga. We have to.
Yeah.
It's okay. It's actually necessary. But I mean, even if we problematize the idea of environmentalism, I mean, what does that mean? What does
many people do.
And so there's like full-bellied environmentalism, which is a sort of a post-industrial idea of how to say, emerges from a post-industrial society that's characterized by a desire for wilderness, unspoiled wilderness.
Yeah.
Where empty belly environmentalism has very little concern with the protection of endangered animals or natural habitats. It's a response to environmental destruction that directly affects the people's way of life and promise for survival. So that's like that's actually a huge rift in the environmental world in terms of activism goes, and it's and of course that comes into our tradition, even when we talk about, let's say, the Dham Seva of protecting, of serving the holy Dham, let's say Vrindavan in particular. Everybody is is outraged, you know, that the trees are gone and the you know, the birds are no longer there. And I feel like, and there's been attempts, these one attempts to sort of regrow the forests, and of course there's amazing outreach going on in terms of providing education, children's education, and so on and so forth in the city of Vrindavan. But we have to be a little careful there.
Yeah.
And it, you know, it goes back to, there's this wonderful Gandhi. There's this wonderful quote of Gandhi's where he's asked, you know, Gandhi is considered the father of an Indian environmental movement. And he's asked, so what do you think of the loss of wilderness and wildlife in India? And he says, well, we will always have the British lion. And that was very much Gandhi's, he had no appreciation for wilderness. He never mentioned ecology. Of course, he traveled all throughout, you know, the rural India, but he had, there's no romantic sort of expression of unspoiled wilderness. So that in itself is actually a big, you know, it's a big question when we think about, so if we do some sort of, if we do sort of apply some sort of environmental activism within our Bhakti framework, like what would that even mean? What would that even look like?
Yeah, and especially, I mean, this is a lot of the questions I've had in some of my own research about this, working with the Govardhan Eco Village in India, is, okay, then how are we as a society, loosely defined and practiced, but also especially in our particular communities, and especially those who are doing the seva, doing the to the land seva, working with cows, growing food, all the devotees who I think I always say are doing the real ego theology because they're putting it into practice. But there's still this problem of our climate catastrophe, and I've a lot of us have changed the way we talk about this in terms of, okay, in previous years we've talked about climate change. It's kind of a neutral definition of what's happening, a description, concept. But then people talk about climate crisis, so it's a crisis that's affecting our society. But now more of us, including myself, are saying this is a climate catastrophe, right? Like this is an emerging catastrophic change to the way that we live together. And there's this constant tension between trying to respond to this with a sense of hope that we can maybe turn towards a more ecological way of life because we're going to be compelled to, or we're going to turn towards something that's more like, I don't know, like a kind of like hard realism about the challenges of it. Like, for example, with environmentalism as another way to complicate this, and a certain, rabbit hole that people can go down, hopefully not too far in their own research, but environmentalism, the Nazis were really good environmentalists. There's a lot of people who use environmentalism to promote like kind of fascist political platforms. In fact, there's a whole thing called eco-fascism, which people are becoming very concerned about. Part of that is just like, we have to, I think what I'm hearing from you and what we've talked about is like, if we're going to be defining this and also trying to define this larger concept of engaged bhakti, we have to kind of de-romanticize it and not make it into this kind of romantical thing, and actually do the good work of seeing how we interpret what's come before so that we can interpret better now. We're not saying we can't have an ecological sense of bhakti or in a sense of engagement, but it has to be rooted in, like, I think, a really clear analysis of the challenges, and also to kind of question our assumptions of where we're coming from.
Yes, so essential. And I mean, if you extend that to, let's say, social justice, I mean, what you brought up is this, we have sort of this romantic narrative of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the great Bhakti saint, as this sort of the early precursor of the nonviolent movement, the nonviolent resistance. And there is a fascinating article in, you mentioned Jack Hawley, in a compendium he recently published with several other scholars. It's called Bhakti and Power.
Yeah, right, yeah.
India's religion of the heart. And there's this fascinating paper that looks at the two most prominent hagiographies of Chaitanya, the Chaitanya Bhagavat and the Chaitanya Charitamrita.
And hagiography is what, for folks who might not know that?
A hagiography is a biography, a biography written from within the tradition.
Yeah.
So there's roughly 70 years between the writing of Chaitanya Bhagavat and the writing of Chaitanya Charitamrita. And within those 70 years, there was a very different political context and climate. So, so the narrative of Chaitanya, so the story goes, right, that Chaitanya is propagating the Sankirtan movement, and the local Brahmins complain to the Muslim judge, the Qazi, sort of like a noise ordinance, that the Sankirtan must stop, and the Qazi agrees. So he decrees, that Sankirtan must stop. This public chanting of Krishna's names must stop. And so there is this Chaitanya leads this Sankirtan party, a protest through the streets to the Muslim judge's home. And in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, we get sort of this, what happens then is sort of this beautiful interfaith dialogue, right? A sort of a interfaith dialogue in which that is not entirely soft, but ultimately Chaitanya, the Qazi submits to Chaitanya's reasoning, and he defeats the Qazi. The Qazi promises to lift the ban on Sankirtan and makes a decree that forever, the Sankirtan movement will never be challenged again. But in the Chaitanya Bhagavat, which is written 70 years earlier, a very different depiction of that protest. It's so heavy, actually. I wrote down some of the heaviest descriptions, because it's a very different understanding of Chaitanya. So in the Chaitanya Bhagavat, this is a translation of the Bengali. It says, Chaitanya says, "Bring the Qazi and cut off his head, destroy his house. Today make the entire world devoid of the Yavanas. Set fire inside the house. Let him be burnt to death. I will kill the sinner who goes against Kirtan. I will kill all of them if they don't perform Kirtan." It's so heavy. Mm-hmm. It's so heavy. And it's a very different depiction of Chaitanya. Of course, that should be seen in the context of the Chaitanya Charitamrita, and sometimes that's, there is sort of warrior talk, but still, it's a heavy passage, and there is a distinct difference between the two passages, presumably because when the Chaitanya Charitamrita was written later, Mughal rule had been firmly established, and there was a period of patronage in which the Bengali Vaishnava community greatly benefited from Mughal rule and patronage. And so in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, the blame goes mostly towards the Smarta Orthodox Brahmins. Earlier, Chaitanya Bhagavat, which was written in a very unstable political time, when Muslim rule was very shaky, and there was a series of different kings and local. It was unstable. The blame goes mostly towards the Muslim rulers. So this is a hermeneutical, sort of heady hermeneutical discussion. But
what does that mean for folks who might not know that one?
how we interpret text,
right?
How do we interpret our scriptures? And so even if we do mine our texts for these nuggets of wisdom, we need to be really careful about how we do that. Yeah. Because this is an amazing example of how there may be some pieces that were not seen clearly. Right. So
I think it's something that we can be conscious of more, that we're always interpreting tradition. That doesn't mean that we're like turning everything into kind of like relative truth. It's just the reality of how people experience spirituality and religion. It's always an interpretation of a core experience. If you're doing the interpretation well, you're trying to illustrate facets of that core truth and core experience. I wouldn't want people to be suspicious of us or devotees like us who do this kind of interpretive work, because this is something that our acharyas have always done. This is something that Srila Prabhupada did constantly. It was, especially a lot of his interpretation was, really geared towards kind of cultural applications. How do you create a Krishna consciousness movement that can speak to so many different cultures around the world? So it's just part of the experience. And something you mentioned, we've talked about, is your spiritual master Vidayananda Maharaj. He talks sometimes about there's like a tension between adaptation within a tradition. How do we adapt the tradition to time, place, and circumstances, as we say, and preservation of core principles. So I think that speaks really well to this exploration of engaged bhakti, because there's a side of it that says we're trying to adapt to movements for justice or movements for well-being that are going on in the world. How do we adapt to the environmental movement or different facets of the environmental movement? People are fighting for climate justice. There's like these groups like Extinction Rebellion or the Climate Strike movement. Like, is there a way that we can adapt our tradition to be kind of service to them, but also to give, I think it might be a two-way street. We want to use the wisdom of our tradition to promote climate justice, but also how do these principles and practices of climate justice inform our practice of bhakti? Like there's an interpretation that goes on there. But then there's that element of not wanting to go too far on the adaptation side, that you might be changing things that shouldn't necessarily be changed, or you might be diluting things. So there's this element of preserving the essence so that your adaptation work has a solid core, right? Like that's that we stay deeply rooted within the tradition that we come from.
Yeah, it's so important. It's this beautiful dance between preservation and adaptation that creates religious continuity and keeps religious practice relevant. Sridayananda Maharaj, H.D. Goswami describes sort of this tension with regards a bow, as in like a bow and arrow, mm-hmm. that has two sides, the bow. And so sort of there's a pull, there's a tension between the two, preservation on one end and adaptation on the other end. And both are necessary to keep the course of the arrow straight. Is this, and actually Krishna Kshetra Maharaj, Kenneth Bell, discusses this concept in his work, sort of tracing the historical adaptation, the historical path of deity worship within our tradition. And he calls it the Bhakti Logos. This Bhakti Logos, which is the principles of Vidhi and Raganuga. So the concept of Vidhi Marg, the path of rules, and Raga Marg, the path of passion, love, devotion. These principles of Vidhi and Rag function interdependently, and he says that like attention cannot be given to the exclusion of the other. Cannot be given to one to the exclusion of the other. It's this sort of crucial tension that keeps us on the straight and narrow path, right? Yeah. And particularly for a religious tradition, I'd say ISKCON is still very much forming its identity, is still very much in its formative period. Is so it's actually remarkable the force of preservation. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable. Because of course Prabhupada really emphasized that, and his students took that very seriously. But how do we intelligently, devotionally move towards adaptation to keep this religious tradition alive? And particularly, H.D. Goswami, his project Krishna West is all about that. And for him, the mission, if you go to the Krishna West website, you'll see how the mission statement is very much about sort of this Krishna West aims to contribute to the re-spiritualization of the planet, which will naturally contribute to social, economic, political, and environmental justice. That's part of the core mission statement. So it's but again, it's tricky. It's tricky, and that is a perennial tension that we will always deal with.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, we're both ecological scholars. One of the things, going back to our New Vrindavan days, and especially when I was humbly serving our dear friend Tapapunj Prabhu and picking green beans in the garden and weeding and doing that seva, but I think he was such a great teacher that and just really my own work just kind of trying to really understand what Prabhupada's vision for ecological communities were. I've been convinced, and I'm more convinced than ever, every single day, that for the health, for the future of our society, of ISKCON, and extending that out to all our Vaishnava brothers and sisters and religious brothers and sisters of other traditions too, that this vision to create ecological communities is really, I would argue, maybe the most important thing we need to do and support right now. And we know kind of the history of the challenges of trying to create these communities. It is hard to work the land, and this is something to talk about. Something we shouldn't have the kind of romantical view about it. It's hard work. It's an entire shift in lifestyle. Many of us have not been raised. Most of us have been raised in urban settings, and we get our food from the supermarket, and everything is very easy. But I continue to, something I want to continue to push myself towards to do in service, and especially with the Govardhan Eco Village in India, for example, is to commit. We need to commit, if not necessarily a full-bodied commitment to that service, because not everyone's going to be a farmer, but how do we continue to try to shift the vision of our society to realize that we have an opportunity here and a necessity to create these communities. But I was just curious about your thoughts as you've been thinking about this. What are some of the biggest challenges we need to consider in doing this? Because it's either people don't think it's important, or they might think it's maybe too easily done, and when they actually do the service, it's something that's not like sustainable, as we say. But there's just such a necessity to continue to develop these communities, and not necessarily as like big eco villages all over the place, but smaller networks of communities that might be able to support each other and support city temples too, because that was very much part of Prabhupada's vision, was like the farm and the city temples have a kind of synthesis going on.
Well, I don't know if I'm on board with your vision.
All right, here we go. Some good controversy.
Yeah. The largest metropolitan city in the world. Here's the thing. I think, Prabhupada was critical of Gandhi. Actually, recently, I want to share something that Prabhupada wrote to Gandhi, a letter that Prabhupada wrote to Gandhi. Because it's sort of, Prabhupada was, so on one hand, Prabhupada was critical of Gandhi. Because he felt that, and this is something that I thought we really have to, wow, oh my God, if Prabhupada was critical of Gandhi, is sort of this great political activist of sort of this like, yeah, what does that say about us and our little attempts? Right. So if Prabhupada was critical of Gandhi, what does that mean for us? But also, he was a proponent of Gandhian's model for sort of the village model, this sort of self-sufficiency model. Prabhupada really liked that system, and that was very much part of Prabhupada's, I would say Prabhupada continued to be very influenced by that model. He was establishing these rural communities throughout the world. I've spent a lot of time living on community, especially rural communities, not only ISKCON. I love that experience. I often wish anyways, that's such, it is sort of that larger project is near and dear to my heart. But what is a sort of what is commonly critiqued about a Gandhian model of ethics is that it is too rural oriented and doesn't address sort of the major urban problems that we need to be addressing. It has, it's just, I don't think it's practical in this age. And maybe it's a romantic ideal that we can strive for, but it's not happening anytime soon. And the Back to the Land movement occurred in the 60s and 70s in the US, and that was like a wonderful sort of time. Many rural communities were established in the US. But I don't see that. I feel like there's a certain naivete. Is that horrible to say? I feel like it's sort of the thing where it's like I mean, I can't tell you how many like hundreds of like vegetarian cooking courses I've offered, and it seems like it is such like a minuscule little contribution. Like maybe I've encouraged a few, I don't even know, but so yeah, we push this like environmental, how to say this, if everybody could just move towards a vegetarian diet, that would actually have like very powerful consequence in terms of like shifting consumer demand. But at the same time, we're sort of ignoring how responsible like major corporations are in the sort of the destruction and the proliferation of environmental destruction. It's like one of those things where and I think about it all the time. I just don't know. I don't know. I think with regards, should somebody move, like start a community or move to a community, that's sort of a very like individual consideration, and maybe different times of your life you can move in and out of those communities, have those communities available as places of like renewal and retreat, totally essential. Will it have, I don't, you'll have to convince me about sort of the necessity of pushing that.
Well, I think what this helps to clarify for me is more, and something I've been thinking about a lot more. We have a tendency in our ISKCON world to try to do the big things and build the big temples, and that's such a challenge. And there's been a relative downsizing of our society in a lot of ways because that has been too big to sustain. At the same time, there are bigger projects in this example. I think of the Govardhan Eco Village or the Radha Krishna Farm community in Hungary, who have proven you can do this on a kind of village size scale, very much that kind of Gandhian model. But I tend to think we sometimes think too big. And what I'm starting to think about more in advocating for this is the sense that we need to create smaller communities. There need to be networks of communities and networks of support. We are not very good as a society, to be blunt, in supporting each other and creating networks of support. If this is going to be feasible, it might look like something that's more like regional networks of devotees being inspired to take a piece of land and to re-spiritualize it and to grow food and to do things on a smaller scale, but to have the support of people near them who are doing this, to have the support perhaps of a local city temple, and not turn it into this huge project. I think that's what might create the possibility of a kind of sustainable network of farm communities, when it's not these huge things, but just smaller communities or smaller projects or smaller homesteads that devotees, but they have to be, you can't be isolated up in like the Adirondacks with no one around you trying to do this. Where is your support? We have to build those networks of support if this is going to happen. There has to be an ecology of support to help the ecology of communities happen. So I don't know if that convinces you more, but
my heart, I agree. Wholehearted agreement, because and I love the concept of rural communities supporting the urban temples. That's a fantastic model. I'm just not aware. Of course, Gita Nagari is. I spent time living in Gita Nagari, and I think over the past 10 years they've had sort of a agricultural renewal at Gita Nagari, and have been supporting some of the urban temples. But I don't know if how well that's going. I love the idea, and maybe that's the point. More energy, more heads, more hands need to be involved, and
more funds too.
To make it a sustainable endeavor, a sustainable economic endeavor. It is. It's hard. It's hard. I spent a lot of time on farms in my 20s. And again, bringing it back to a lot of that motivation, I think was based on like this sort of impending fear of the apocalypse. And I thought, okay, I need to like create a self-sufficient farm, right? So for my survival, or for like our community survival. And that only, fear-based sort of action only lasts so long. And then you're just like, okay, I'm in my like early 20s and living in the middle of the Adirondacks, literally by myself. Anyways, it's just, it's one of those, I love that vision, but life happens, and now I'm living in urban Tokyo, and it's just like what I think that's common for anybody who goes through that sort of, who has a call to the land. But yeah, it's just, this is a post, what is it, pre-post, the romantic sort of, I just don't think it's so practical. But that being said, it's very fulfilling work, and I applaud anybody who's doing that work, and I applaud all endeavors. For me, it's absolutely essential that I have a garden at all times. My husband gifted me a rental garden. Garden space is very precious in Tokyo, land in general. So for me, that is essential work. That's part of my nature. It's just my hands in the ground.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Well, yeah, this is just really, there's so much to think about, and coming to the end of this phase of our great conversation, but I wanted to ask you one more question before we end this evening, or this morning for you. You're talking about how we need to move if we are engaging, and that can be the engagement that is however we serve in this world. We're always engaging. I think that's maybe the one truth about Engaged Bhakti, is we're always engaging through our devotion. That takes on many different forms, but what is it about this practice of bhakti for you which has inspired you and moved you from that space, as you said before, where a lot of your work was based on kind of like fear of the apocalypse and those kinds of intense emotions? But what is it about the practice and experience of bhakti that moves you now in your engagement, that has taken you above and beyond that kind of fear space? Or what has bhakti helped you to develop within your own practice of engagement with the world that is more feasible, more sustainable, more healthy, more realistic to how we engage with all of these challenges in our lives and challenges we share together? And that's a big question. I always end with a super big question for the person.
Yeah. Almost gives me chills when my heart is like racing. We had like a few other things we wanted to cover in this podcast. One of them was like how I was very inspired by Prabhupada's personal background and his coming to sort of accept Krishna consciousness as his life's mission, because he was a nationalist. Prabhupada was an activist, a student of Gandhi. Prabhupada was, was kind of hardcore. Like, he rejected his diploma. He completed exams, but he just like rejected the diploma as an act of non-cooperation. So Prabhupada was like, he was radical. I was also reading last night, he played soccer in college, which I was like, yeah.
He was the goalie, right? Is it because he wanted to not be too, and like, he didn't want to work too hard, lazy intelligence. The goalie is very important, for all of us football fans know.
Oh.
the last line of defense.
Yeah, it just like makes me love Prabhupada even more. But so, but when he met his, so that's his background. And then when he met his teacher, his spiritual teacher, who at the time he thought was just another sadhu, another, Bhakti Siddhanta said, right, that you should. He encouraged these young boys who had gathered to go out and preach this Chaitanya's mission throughout the world, and Prabhupada was like, who's going to listen to us? Who's going to listen to kids who are part of this like dependent country? And Bhakti Siddhanta, anyways, basically saying the independence movement is crucial. First, we need to see to our independence, then we can, get back to this spiritual practice. And Bhakti Siddhanta was, explaining that Krishna consciousness can't wait. It's so crucial, and it's not dependent on stable politics. It's not stable on the waves of politics, and how it's actually the greatest welfare work. And so for me, my personal inspiration, what has sort of locked me in over the years is I can't come up with, I've tried, I think, to find something else that would excuse me or divert. I just can't think of any greater welfare work than Krishna consciousness, because it addresses. The beautiful thing is that the ends are the means. So it's an immediately beautiful process. And so you always have to be wary if there's sort of like these, how do you say, like if all the rewards are in the next life, you might want to be weary of that religious path. But the practice of Krishna consciousness, I mean, and just at the core, the chanting of Hare Krishna is such a beautiful, beautiful process. It's beautiful from the beginning to the end. It is such a powerful process. And the culture of Krishna consciousness, the incorporation of striving towards a vegetarian diet and moving towards a mode of goodness, a lifestyle of compassion. I can't think of another process which is more effective in terms of changing the consciousness, which is at the root of the environmental crisis. Right? It's, if you're looking, that I've always been trying to look for the root. What's deeper? And I think just at the root is a darkened consciousness, an unconsciousness, which in an unconscious state, greed proliferates exponentially. And so that's what holds me. That's what that's what keeps me firm.
Well, thank you for that. That's amazing. I agree 100,000,000% with all of that. And I know we did a bunch of stuff we wanted to get to as well, but we'll get to that in an upcoming episode. As we always say in the business here, leave them wanting more. So that's where we'll end here for now. I just want to thank you. This is just an amazing, wide-ranging conversation, but I think we're really just talking about such essential stuff. And I really appreciate too especially why I wanted to really reconnect with you and bring you on here was, to be doing this kind of critical thinking about this. I imagine folks who are scholars who are watching this getting a lot of nectar from our critical thinking, but we hope to do that. For folks who are following along with our podcast and trying to really think through this concept and this practice, it takes work and care, and especially not being kind of polemical about it or too strident about it, but like trying to really discover the practice that we're doing. So I just really appreciate the critical lens and the thinking that we're doing together.
Usually I only do paid gigs, but it's an auspicious month, so I'm feeling kind of charitable.
Well, once this podcast moves out of this lo-fi indie rock phase, and we have sponsors and microphones and things, I will be happy to compensate the guests. But I'm just a poor religious studies scholar, adjunct here in my temporary office. I don't have much to offer except just good conversations. But thank you so much, Ali Krishna, and we will connect again soon. And thank you everyone who has watched. Again, subscribe. We'll be continuing to produce more of these podcast conversations soon, and we hope you've gotten a lot out of this conversation. So thank you, Ali Krishna, and thank you everybody for watching. Hare Krishna, everybody.
Hare Krishna.